some years ago, I discovered Asian timber framing, which has a tradition that's great and glorious and a bit different from the Western tradition. I became interested in Chinese temple building, and what you see here is a replica of a corner bracket set from a temple entry gate building. This is from the Temple of Solitary Joy. It's several hours outside of Beijing in northern China. It's survived 30-some major earthquakes since it was built, and partly that's due to brackets and a completely different idea about building, which is that buildings are flexible, kind of like the human body, and when there's earthquake shaking, they can move and dissipate the energy without absorbing the full shock. This is the main hall, which houses a 50-foot sculpture of the goddess Guanyin, a goddess of mercy. And this is the entry gate, or so-called mountain gate, that everybody passes through to enter the temple grounds. These are some views of the mountain gate from where this bracket set comes. And you can see from the different views, the shape of the roof and the feeling of the building is completely different in each photograph. This is a beautiful view looking down on the roof, and I think this view really caught my heart for its simplicity and beauty. Hard to see, but it's the bracket sets which support the roof, which has such a wide reach, wide overhang, wide eave beyond the building. One of the suppositions is that in the early days, the walls were made just of dried clay, and they were very susceptible to rain. So having a wide roof would protect the building from rain and deterioration. Of course, a wide roof also provides lots of shade. Probably the third reason for a wide overhang is a sense of proportion, so that you don't have a sort of a tall, grand building with a little short-brimmed hat on it. You have something that's has a gesture and an appeal to it. Probably the most dramatic feature inside are two warriors. I believe that they're to scare away any bad thoughts you might bring and scare away any bad spirits that might be trying to get in to the temple grounds. In Chinese, bracket is called dogung. Do is these small bearing blocks, and gung are beams and tie beams in a horizontal orientation, and they're kind of interwoven. And in the interweaving and the joining of so many surfaces, you get flexibility and some friction, and this helps to dissipate any shaking force from an earthquake. One of the big surprises to me as I began to study bracket sets was that there's only one thing holding them together, and that's gravity. So each piece just rests on top of another. They're often located with little wooden pegs or pins to keep them aligned, but it's really just gravity. There's no pegs as in Western timber framing. All the load from the roof on this bracket set comes back to the main bearing block, which sits directly on top of a round column. So this is the base bearing block, and then the small bearing blocks, there are several different variations, but essentially similar. There are shaped arms, horizontal arms, that have, it's actually facets, but it looks from a distance like a curve, or they can have a pointed shape. So a bracket set is classified in several ways by the number of tiers. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tiers, and by the number of steps. So if I rotate this bracket set around, we can see this is the wall plane here, and from the wall plane there's 1 step, 2 step, and actually 3 steps out from the building. So these steps help to bring supporting members so that the roof can reach further out than if it was just resting on top of the wall beam. Brackets, you learn the language of brackets, which is the layout, the similarity. Most of the bracket arm pieces are the same dimension. Most of the bearing blocks are the same dimension. The joinery is fairly straightforward. It's often a simple half lap, maybe a housed half lap. There's some dovetails occasionally. The joinery, there's, I guess, an old saying that the bigger the building, the looser the joinery. So this is not sort of furniture grade joinery where it has to be perfect and it has to be forced together. This is more of a kind of a slip fit. So the joinery just wants to go together, doesn't want to be sloppy, but you don't want to have to fight it because there's so many things that have to work together. You want to have a little bit of flexibility in it. I'd like to show you how a bracket set's assembled. So we'll start with the base block. This is the focal point of the whole bracket set. The bracket set reaches out beyond, and all the weight and load is concentrated on this one piece, which sits directly on top of a column. So a base block for a corner block will have 3 pieces crossing, 2 at a right angle in the wall plane, and then 1 at a 45-degree angle in the line of the hip. So we'll start with the first piece. It'll sit in a channel, and you can see already there's a space for a diagonal hip piece. The second piece in the wall plane captures the first piece and locks in place. And finally, the hip captures these 2 pieces and rests just on a little bit of a corner of the base block. So now we see the first tier sitting on the base block, directly resting on the column below. 3 pieces, 6 bearing blocks, and 12 floating tenons. When construction is happening, the pieces are assembled one by one, and they have to go in a particular order. They wouldn't be assembled as a whole tier, but I'm just showing you tier by tier what they look like and which pieces are involved. We have 2 horizontal beams that lap. Like this. And I'll orient it. This is the slot again for the hip line. These are now, this is centered on the wall. The building's inside. Outside of the building is here. So these members will be outside of the building. So fits underneath it. And then this is the hip line piece. This captures the center. This captures the outboard arms. Okay. Tier 2, as you can see, it's locked into the first tier because of the floating tenons and the bearing blocks. Here we have 5 pieces, number of bearing blocks, and you can see the bearing blocks are cut differently depending on their function. So this is a standard bearing block. This is one that's going to receive a member going 45 degrees this way. This one's going to receive a member coming out in front, and this is going to receive 2 members that cross over on top of this. One thing that surprised me is that this detail seems fairly fragile, but in fact I don't know if I've ever seen one that was broken in a real building, so it works. You may notice that there's 2 sizes of arms. This is the standard size, and this is the large size. A standard size plus a bearing block equals the same height as the large size. So here we're using the bearing blocks to gain elevation to equal this, and that's basic to the design of bracket sets. Now we'll look at the third tier. Tier 2 had 5 main beams. Tier 3 has 6. And what's interesting about Tier 3, among other things, is that you have 4 beams all crossing at the same point. So you see it's not very thick at the crossing point, but again, the fact that the low beams below it are supporting it gives it strength to bear the weight above. This is the only tier that has bearing blocks cut at a 45-degree angle, and the only tier that has the shaping on the facets on the end also at a 45-degree angle. Then this is the second piece. This is the third piece. And you can see now again we've established the channel for the 45-degree hip. So this is the 4th member, and it will land here. And this is the 5th member, and so it interlocks out here and further in. And we still established the channel going through. And here is the hip member, and so it has the same detail to lock both intersections, this point being again the center point of the corner of the wall. All right, so this is the third tier, getting more complex and interesting and heavier. Okay, now we're going to place parts for tier number 4 on top of tier number 3. Okay, here's the first part. Here's the standard crossing. So these 2 pieces are in the line of the wall. Here's again a hip member crossing at 45 degrees. And when you see this kind of rounded shape, it suggests that there's going to be a round purlin coming up. So I should explain what is a purlin. So a purlin is a horizontal beam. It can be round, it can be square, it can be rectangular, but typically in Chinese architecture. It's a round member. It can be parallel to the wall, outside the wall, above the wall, or inside. And rafters are placed on top of the purlins. So the height and the angle of the purlin starts to suggest the slope of the roof. These are the small channel members in which the purlins will rest. Okay, we're good there. And then this is the first round purlin, and I've attached on it what's called a pillow block. And while most of the rafters rest on the purlin, which is a continuous piece around the whole building, when you come to the corner, they rest on the pillow block, and it creates the rise at the corner of the roof. So the roof curves both from eave up to the ridge, and it curves across the face of the building, rising towards the ends at the hip. And there's a typical half lap joint here for the round purlins. So I'll place the first one. And second one. Okay, so the tier 4 is now complete. This is actually a fairly simple tier. It sits on top of the wall plane. And it's beveled on the top edge. So this suggests the slope of the roof. If this were a rafter, the rafter would rest on the round purlin, on the beam and the wall plane, and then there'll be an interior purlin which will line up on the same slope. So this is the second member, mirror image. Again, the channel for the hip. And here is the hip member. Okay. So that's tier 5. So in terms of the wall plane, this is the top of the bracket set. There'll be 2 more tiers on the inside of the building that hold an interior purlin. In Chinese buildings, the rafters don't go all the way from the ridge to the eave. They're short, and they just go from purlin to purlin or purlin to beam. And that way, as the purlin or beam slope changes, the rafters make a segmented curve, and that's how they create the curved roof from the eave to the ridge. Now we've come to the final 2 tiers, tier 6 and tier 7, which are on the interior of the building. And to show that, I'll rotate this bracket set so we can see what's going on and so I can reach it more easily. There we go. Okay. So this is tier 6. It sits on the tail. All these cantilevers, tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, its load is being carried way out from the center of the building where the column is. So this is tier 6. Again, these are continuous members going all the way around the building. This is the finished end here, and we'll have the interior purlins sit above that. Okay, so this in a nutshell is a Sung Dynasty corner bracket set, 1/4 of real size, from the Temple of Solitary Joy Mountain Gate entrance building. So even though this is the complete bracket set with purlins, one final thing we can do is add the hip on it, and then it will be the total structural package. So to do that, I'm going to rotate the bracket set again. And I'll put the hip in place. Again, strangely, the hip is just held by gravity. And there you have it, in all its beautiful complexity and splendor. You know, my final thoughts on this is that I've been so happy to discover a different tradition, and as I've gotten to learn a little bit about Chinese architecture, to admire the creativity, the sophistication, the perseverance, the pursuit of beauty, and the ability to handle such complexity to create a unique style of architecture. So, thank you for sharing my pleasure.